Fandom is a funny thing. It can take people who have nothing in common other than liking the same show or band or team and bring them together into a community, and that can be a really wonderful thing. It can also be the exact opposite. After all, just because someone else is, say, a pro wrestling fan, that doesn't mean I'm gonna get along with them. I know this will come as a shock to many of you, but lots of wrestling fans are major assholes. In fact, lots of people are major assholes, generally speaking. So many people that, while it's always disappointing, it should never be surprising when we encounter them in our various fan communities. Having said that, I admit there is one particular subgroup of a fan community that did surprise me when I first learned about them. That group is conservatives, and that fan community is, of course, the Star Trek fan community. For those of you who are as naive as I used to be, yes, there are conservatives who love Star Trek. A lot of them. How many? How large a percentage of the overall fan base are they? I don't know, but I run into them often enough that I sometimes find myself wondering, what do conservatives actually like about Star Trek? First, let me clear something up. A second ago, I was talking about how every fandom has its assholes, and then I transitioned straight into conservative Star Trek fans. That may have given some of you the impression that I was trying to imply that conservatives are, by definition, assholes. So, if you are a conservative and you thought that's what I was doing just now, let me assure you, I'm not saying that being a conservative automatically means that you are an asshole. I'm saying it means you think like an asshole. I'm saying it means you hold certain opinions which could lead other people, judging your character on the basis of those opinions, to conclude that you're an asshole. But it doesn't mean you are one necessarily. I cannot wait for the comments on this one. Oh, your bias is so blatant. I expected you to be more impartial. But why? As delightful as it would be, and as richly as they deserve it, I'm not going to spend the rest of this video insulting conservatives. I'm going to insult them intermittently while exploring the various aspects of Star Trek that I think they're attracted to. But before that exploration can get underway, I think a definition is in order. What do I mean when I say conservative? Very broadly speaking, for the purposes of this video, I'm defining a conservative as someone who favors unregulated free market economics, who wants small government, who values individual liberty but also seeks to maintain traditional social and political hierarchies, who prefers stability over social change, who is skeptical of progress, who finds social justice movements either unnecessary or threatening, who is pro-military, nationalistic, and who tends to vote for right-wing candidates in elections. Are all conservatives all of those things? No. Do some conservatives have traits I didn't list just now? Yes. But in general, I think that gives you a pretty good idea of who I'm talking about when I say conservative. So, why the hell would someone like that enjoy Star Trek, which has always been openly and intentionally progressive? There are a few plausible reasons. Many conservatives who have commented on my videos claim to enjoy Star Trek purely as an escapist sci-fi action-adventure show. They're either oblivious to its often heavy-handed political messaging, or they willfully ignore it. Some are so determined to view the show as nothing more than a shallow, silly outer space romp that they get annoyed with people like me for injecting politics into Star Trek, which, okay, I get that maybe you'd prefer not to focus on that part of the show because you don't like constantly being told what a dick you are, but nobody has to inject politics into Star Trek. They're already in there. Whining over people injecting politics into Star Trek makes as much sense as criticizing that video I made about Worf a while back for injecting Klingons into Star Trek. Like what you like for whatever reason you like it, but just because you don't pay attention to the show doesn't mean the rest of us don't. I found the "it's just a silly sci-fi show" thing to be an especially common reason given by those who have enjoyed older Star Trek shows or films but don't like more recent productions, such as the Kelvin Timeline movies or Discovery or Picard. I've gotten numerous comments from people who say they liked Star Trek before it got preachy, or back when the writers didn't feel the need to push their political opinions onto the audience. How did these people not see the political messages in original series episodes like Balance of Terror or A Private Little War, or next-gen episodes like The Measure of a Man or The Outcast? For some, I think they might have missed the political content of older Star Trek because they didn't feel personally called out by it. Star Trek is popular all around the world, but it has always been first and foremost an American show produced for an American audience. That being the case, the heroes are mostly Americans, metaphorically and also literally, with a few notable exceptions like Captain Picard or Scotty, who are established as originating from outside North America and speak with accents that mark them as such. The heroes in Star Trek, especially TOS and TNG era Star Trek, are straightforward, brave, moral. They represent law and virtue and enlightenment. The Federation itself is depicted as an overwhelmingly positive institution. Sure, there's a bad apple every now and then, but fundamentally, the Federation exemplifies benevolent affluence. Its society is open, tolerant, and just. It tries to keep the peace, but when it goes to war, it's always for a good reason, and the enemies are invariably a dire threat to life and liberty in the galaxy. That sounds a lot like how conservatives describe the United States. The shining city on a hill, the land of the free and the home of the brave. Indispensable. Exceptional. The socio-political problems addressed by Star Trek are usually, and in TOS and the TNG era nearly always, found in societies from outside the Federation. It's the Cardassians who occupied Bajor, the Romulans who manipulated galactic politics to their own advantage, the Klingons who practiced aggressive militarism. It's those people over there whose religious credulity allowed a con artist to take advantage of them, or who discriminated against people of a particular gender identity or sexual orientation, or who hated each other for superficial, arbitrary reasons. Despite their well-earned reputation for bigotry and small-mindedness, I've found that many conservatives are willing, even eager, to support social justice movements so long as those movements operate externally. Women's liberation is fine for Saudi Arabia, just not for us. We don't need it here. It's them over there. They've got the problem. I'm not saying Star Trek intentionally sends the message that the United States is an ideal society and it's only other countries that need fixing, but because the show's political messages are so often carried by stories where the heroes confront the problems of other cultures rather than their own, it's easy to see how some people in the audience, people who aren't naturally inclined to concern about social justice issues in their own culture to begin with, can take it that way. They need to change is a much more acceptable message than we need to change. And that holds true for all of us, no matter where we fall on the political spectrum, but I think it especially applies to conservatives because hostility to change isn't just their natural human instinct, it's a pillar of their worldview. There's something else that we all tend to do, again, regardless of our political perspectives, that helps to account for how conservatives could enjoy a show as didactically progressive as Star Trek. We interpret things in ways that are comfortable for us. There have been numerous episodes of Star Trek with political messages which, by my reading, are harshly critical of the right-wing politics and antiquated social attitudes typically embraced by conservatives. But I've found that many conservatives are able to enjoy those episodes because they just don't see them the same way I do. For instance, take the TNG episode The Drumhead. To me, and to most people, including Jerry Taylor, who wrote it, the Drumhead is a warning against the dangers of Red Scare-style witch hunts. It's one of the few TNG-era episodes where the threat does come from within the Federation. The villain of the piece, Admiral Satie, seeks to discredit and destroy first an otherwise innocent Enterprise crewman who is found to have concealed his Romulan heritage, and then Captain Picard himself, whose only crime was to question Admiral Satie's methods while standing up for the persecuted crewmen. As Picard says to Worf at the end of the episode, villains like Admiral Satie will always be around, and every society, even one as evolved and enlightened as the Federation of the 24th century, will have to remain eternally vigilant in order to stop them from exploiting our fears and prejudices in order to gain power. The most dangerous thought we can ever have is that it couldn't happen here. That's how I read it. However, I've seen conservative Star Trek fans cite Picard's defense of individual liberty during his testimony at Admiral Satie's hearing in order to justify tolerating hate speech. Because, after all, as Picard says in that scene, the first time any man's freedom is trodden on, we're all damaged. Clearly he was championing the cause of deplatformed white supremacists and Islamophobes. Is that an incorrect reading of the text of that episode? Well, no, that's not really how it works. Terms like correct and incorrect don't apply. A reading of the drumhead wherein the episode argues, albeit indirectly, in favor of tolerating hate speech is one of many possible interpretations. I think it says a whole lot more about the priorities of the person doing the interpreting than the intentions of the people who made the episode, but the point is, the explanation for how a conservative could like that episode lies in the possibility of such an interpretation. It's not just episodes. People can read characters they like or identify with so that those characters seem a lot more like them than their creators probably intended. A few years ago, Anna Marie Cox interviewed Republican Senator, spineless Trump bootlicker, and all-around sack of shit Ted Cruz, and during their conversation, Cruz revealed that not only is Kirk his favorite Star Trek captain, but he thinks it's quite likely that Kirk is a Republican. I guess it kinda makes sense if I get inside Ted Cruz's head, which is easy actually. I just imagine what it's like to hate marginalized people more than I love my wife. I mean, Kirk does recite the preamble to the U.S. Constitution at the end of the Omega Glory, and we all know how much American conservatives love the Constitution. It's where most of them discovered the joys of self-servingly and selectively interpreting texts. On the other hand, in Star Trek VI, Captain Kirk acknowledges and overcomes his own racism, so I don't see how he could possibly be a Republican, just as a matter of canon. Keep in mind, in that same interview, Cruz also says the original Star Trek pressed for racial equality, but it did so without sermonizing, which, okay, how many goddamn times do I have to cut to stills from Let That Be Your Last Battlefield before you assholes accept that Star Trek the original series was the preachiest show ever? It's always been political. It's never been subtle about it. They're half white and half black, for Christ's sake. This is understated social commentary to you? There's also a streak of conservatism tucked away within Star Trek's oft-celebrated aspirational vision of the future. Again, I don't think it's intentional, but it's definitely there, and I can see how it might appeal to a person with a conservative mindset. Star Trek depicts the Earth of centuries to come as a paradise, a place of prosperity and equality and peace. It's a prophecy of hope and possibility. We can overcome our prejudices. We can value curiosity over ignorance. We can live by our noblest ideals instead of our worst impulses. And when we do, we can create a world without poverty, without war, where everyone has an opportunity to live and grow and explore their potential. And it's all so far in the future that we don't need to even worry about building toward it right now. See, there are two ways to respond to Star Trek's depiction of a hopeful future for humanity. There's the progressive response. Now that we have an idea of what the world could be like if we achieved something close to true social justice and equality, let's all get to work making that world happen. That's the response the creators of Star Trek were hoping for when they made the show. Gene Roddenberry said so. But there's also the conservative response. Humanity figures all this stuff out eventually, so just relax. Let's also remember that, as is explicitly established in the film Star Trek First Contact, humanity doesn't really start to get its shit together until after Zefram Cochrane becomes the first human to fly a ship at warp speed, which attracts the attention of the Vulcans. Which means not only is our happy, egalitarian future far enough away that we don't have to start working on it for a while yet, It's just a fantasy anyway. It's all a part of the silly space show. Just enjoy the silly space show that isn't about anything. I've also gotten this from conservative Star Trek fans more times than I can remember. Star Trek shows us what we can accomplish when we stop making everything about race and gender. Seems like an odd statement to make in reference to a show that has produced so many episodes arguing passionately against unjust discrimination. If Star Trek is saying the solution to racism is to stop talking about racism, why does Star Trek talk about racism so much? But that's another unintended consequence of showing us a society where people have finally put a lid on prejudice and inequality. Conservatives see a diverse, multicultural, gender-equal society where racism and sexism are hardly ever even mentioned explicitly, and they think, see, the crew of the Enterprise gets along fine and they don't worry about this stuff. Why should we? Up to this point, the reasons I've offered for why conservatives like Star Trek have been based heavily on interpretation, but there are other aspects of Star Trek that I think allow the show to appeal to a conservative without having to read them differently than the authors intended, write them off as fantasies, or allow them to be swallowed up by the pulverizing gravity well of moral apathy and selfishness that sits where their heart should be. In certain ways, Star Trek is a lot more conservative than politically correct SJW soy boys like myself like to admit. The most conservative thing about Star Trek is probably that it centers, for the most part, on Starfleet, which is a military organization. I know company line, both in universe and in real life, is that Starfleet is not the military. Its purpose is science and exploration and diplomacy, and that's great, but also that's bullshit. Yes, Starfleet does all of those things, but it also has a ranked hierarchy, a formal chain of command, and when the Federation goes to war, it's Starfleet that fights. There's no getting around it. It's the Space Navy. And in Star Trek, Starfleet is the ultimate instrument of good. Starfleet brings aid to the needy, it brings civilization to wild, uncharted worlds in the form of Federation colonies, it protects the Federation and indeed the rest of the galaxy from the threats of other, less benevolent nations. That's exactly how many American conservatives see our armed forces. Why wouldn't they enjoy a show that celebrates and glorifies the military and reinforces their view of it as a noble and necessary institution? There's also the fact that most Star Trek heroes have been human, and the majority of them have been white, particularly the series leads, while the villains are nearly always identifiable at a glance as non-human. Klingons have bumpy foreheads and darker skin. Cardassians have visible ridges on their faces and necks and darker skin. Jem'Hadar have bony spikes, a rugged reptilian appearance, and darker skin. Are you starting to see why this might appeal to conservative white people? It's not that Star Trek is intentionally racist, usually, but it does contain certain tropes that people with racist beliefs, biases, or assumptions could find comforting. In conclusion, if you are a conservative who is a Star Trek fan, please don't watch my channel. But before you go, I'm really not trying to gatekeep the Star Trek fan community. It's not up to me or anyone else to decide who is a real Trekkie and who isn't. If you like Star Trek, then you're a Star Trek fan, and I'm not here to tell you otherwise. I am here to make fun of you, because you have it coming, for being a boulder around the neck of society, and to tell you that your politics suck and are the cause of many of the problems addressed by Star Trek, and represent the antithesis of the intended message of Star Trek. Whatever message you take from it is your business. Please feel free to discuss it somewhere else with someone who is not me. I don't care. So, yeah. There are lots of reasons why conservatives might like Star Trek. I don't think the creators of the various Star Trek series have had appealing to conservatives or validating conservative attitudes in mind very often while producing the shows, but that doesn't matter. We can all watch the exact same show and take away entirely different things from it. Often, what we take away looks an awful lot like what we brought with us. Well, folks, there you have the What Do Conservatives Actually Like About Star Trek video. I'm sure it won't be divisive or offensive to anyone. In just a sec, I'm going to clue you in as to what the topic of the next Regulation Trek Actually video will be. But first, I want to give shout outs to some of my newest Patreon patrons. Their names are GLEN HELWIG, thank you GLEN. Sebastian Antunes, thank you Sebastian. Ben KAYSER, thank you Ben. Felix Kallman, thank you Felix. Matt Levens, thank you Matt. Mike Yoakum, thank you Mike. Alex Blocker, thank you Alex. Andre Krishkovich, thank you Andre. David Appleman, thank you David. Laura Plains, thank you Laura. Elvis Needs Boats, thank you Elvis Needs Boats. Sean ZOLTEK, thank you Sean. Chuckie Reynaldo, thank you Chuckie. And Kelly WILBAR, thank you Kelly. A heartfelt thank you to all my patrons, however much you're pledging and however long you've been pledging for. I could not do this without your support. If you are not a patron, you can become one by going to patreon.com/Steve Shives and making a monthly pledge of any amount from $1 on up to however much you can afford or you think I'm worth. $5 a month gets you a shout out at the end of a Trek Actually video. Any amount gets you access to the polls where you can vote for the topics of future videos. The poll for May's video goes live a few hours after this video will be published, so watch for that at patreon.com/Steve Shives. Before I tell you what the topic of next month's video will be, I just want to quickly remind you that besides producing these YouTube videos, I also co-host a Star Trek-themed comedy podcast alongside the brilliant and hilarious Jason Harding called The Ensign's Log. Jason and I play low-ranking officers serving aboard a certain famous Federation starship as it carries out a certain legendary 5-year mission. We're just about to start our 3rd season, and we couldn't be more excited. So if you haven't checked out The Ensign's Log, please give it a listen. Links are in the description box. You can listen to it at the website or on SoundCloud or subscribe via RSS to listen with your favorite podcast app. Now, the topic of April's Regulation Trek Actually video, as chosen by my Patreon patrons who voted in the most recent poll, will be: which Star Trek character actually has the most wasted potential? We all love the breakout characters: Spock, Data, Garrick, Holodoc, Seven, but what about the characters who showed such promise at the beginning only to be sidelined and overlooked? Well, they shall be overlooked no longer. Afterthoughts of Star Trek, next month's episode is for you. Should be a fun video. Thank you all so much for being with me for this one, and I'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.